Garwood, editor-in-chief of ABF Journal. Joining me on the podcast today is Kyle Shonak. Kyle is Chief Transaction Officer North America at Gordon Brothers. Kyle, thanks so much for being on the podcast. I'm excited to talk with you today.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time and having me on. So thank you.
Definitely. So let's just start with the current environment. Um, the tariffs have been reinstated, specifically affecting mid-market businesses. What are you seeing out there right now?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this journey through the tariffs have caused quite a bit of volatility, almost a guessing game with some companies, right? Of what's going into place, how long is it going to go into place? I think, right now, obviously, some of the tariffs are affecting middle market companies a little bit differently than others, depending on where your products are coming in for. You've got 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum, 25% on concrete. These obviously are raising costs dramatically that middle market companies are having to deal with. Especially if they're, in the like heavier trade regions, call it, California, Southern California, Texas, the Northeast. Those can add up to billions of dollars that they need to kind of reconcile and figure out if they're going to take it on themselves and not pass it through, or actually pass it through to the customer, which is the big question right now and how they're dealing with it. This obviously, Gordon Brothers, we appraise all kinds of assets, so we have visibility into all of it, but we are known for, our consumer focus, and wholesale and retail are particularly exposed here because their reliance on the tariff countries. From a lender's standpoint, the other wrinkle that you sort of get introduced into is that the cost of the tariffs are showing up on the balance sheet and kind of inflating inventory from a cost perspective. But that doesn't always translate through to actually the value of the collateral itself that we're lending off of. So I think that in of itself is kind of adding to a really, dynamic and quick moving market as it is. I think today everything moves more quickly today, right? Whether it's things on your phone, you can start a business tomorrow, or anything else, and then you layer on top of that the uncertainty and sort of like ups and downs that we're dealing with tariffs, and it can definitely be challenging for sure.
Definitely. So just looking at all of the different business types out there, what makes middle market companies particularly vulnerable to these kinds of shocks? You talked about, retail and wholesale being affected, but more so than small business or large corporate borrowers.
Right. Well, I think that especially when you're looking at middle market firms, they tend to run a little bit leaner. They don't have as large of balance sheets, and they don't have as much, bargaining power from a scale perspective, right? So it's one thing for Walmart to be able to say, like, we're not going to pass anything on to the consumers, but it's very different to mom and pop middle market sort of companies that they don't have the technology. Like I said, they're a lot leaner with their resources internally, with people to actually do this. So a lot of times, what we're seeing is, they need some sort of outside help, or they get some advisory around, whether it's financial or from an asset perspective. So, what we've been doing a lot at Gordon Brothers and seeing a lot more of is, rather than just looking at sort of points in time from an appraisal perspective, is because there's so much moving and there's so much that companies are trying to do and move as quickly as they can. Sometimes that's a little bit slower than anybody would like, or not. So a lot of times we're seeing them go to outside resources that have expertise on whether it's asset values, whether it's how we're seeing, what's happening with their supply chain and where they sit in the supply chain, and how that kind of rolls through to the end user at the end of the day, and how that affects the borrowing base that lenders kind of need to be looking at on a regular basis. Is that, it's not just about, can they execute it, which goes back to the leaner staffs and the limited resources and not as much scale, but also is like, do they have the liquidity to do it over the length of time that they need to be implementing it? And then, obviously there's bumps in the roads and twists and turns along the way. So, I think that it's what we're seeing is that a lot more diligence around what the margins and how those are all affected by, the throughputs through the supply chain and how those changing along the way as well.
Definitely. So when you look at all the different industry types that our industry serves, are certain industries being hit harder by the tariffs than others?
Yeah, I mentioned the wholesale and retail. We're also
Mhm.
seeing in commercial industrial as well, but the reliance, I think I saw something that, just tariffs in China along are going to raise costs over $20 billion, right?
Mm.
So, and that all kind of like rolls through and again back to when are they making the decisions and when's the right time to, either push it through to the consumer or not. But and then it also is affecting their business on, from their suppliers or for their vendors, right? Is that, some of the borrowers that we deal with, their receivables are getting stretched. So, which obviously affects the borrowing base and affects their liquidity to be able to deal with all of the changes and the slowing of the working capital cycle and how much more expensive it is. So you kind of get it on both sides depending on where you sit on the supply chain. So I think it's really it always comes down to how often are you touching your client, right? So like how often are you talking to your client? Do you understand the challenges that are going on? Are you checking in more frequently on the borrowing base? Are you digging a little bit how are things this year versus last year with certain customers? Where's the values and what are we seeing from a trending perspective? Because from our perspective at Gordon Brothers is that we're doing a lot more work for banks to more frequently check valuations and check the rigor around the assets themselves. From Gordon Brothers' perspective of where our lending platform sits and how it interrelates with the rest of everything that is going on at Gordon Brothers is that we have the asset expertise in-house, but like we're also working with our bank partners outside to give them the same access to the asset experts. I mean, at the end of the day, Gordon Brothers it's a financial services firm that has asset expertise in all kinds of categories. So if you think about it, right, and you take a step back, is if we're doing over 2,000 appraisals a year, we're seeing a lot of different ways that changes in, fiscal policy and the tariffs affect different industries, right? So we see what, 10 different manufacturers of widgets are doing in response to the tariffs, and we see some of them that work, some of them that don't, but at the end of the day, we see how it affects value. And the A in asset-based lending is assets. So leveraging the asset experts that you have internally or externally, depending on where you sit, is like absolutely critical. And being more focused on that as much as financial performance and how those interplay is really important from our perspective.
Definitely. So you talked about, making it a regular practice to check in with clients and see how things are going. When lenders are doing that, are there specific warning signs that they should be watching for in terms of their clients' performance or behavior?
Yeah, I think if you think about various classes of assets, obviously working capital is probably the first place to look because that's turning much more quickly. And you can start to see, like I mentioned before, is you start to see trends in the receivables side of things of like collection times and your turns there on the receivables. And then on the inventory, the same thing is that not only are they getting the inventory, are they able to bring in all the inventory that they're looking for and like they need to maintain sort of the appraisal values and the levels, but also like what are they selling it at? Like what margins are they able to actually be able to realize? And are those margins on par with expectations from a financial performance before? And then obviously, the margins play a big part in the overall valuation of the firm. The other place that we're seeing it a lot is that the throughputs of machinery and equipment with whether it's their suppliers on parts and those type of things, those are beginning to be hit because of the aluminum and steel I talked about. And are they paying more to maintain their machinery and equipment or invest in a new machinery and equipment? We've seen a lot of canceled orders there. Or are they not maintaining their M&E as much as they used to in the past because it's more expensive to? right? So, what we see a lot of is, and what we try and do is that if there's machinery and equipment involved in a transaction getting out and actually looking and like feeling and touching it so that and you see that it's being maintained at the level that you're expecting, so that if something does happen, then you don't get out there and it's very different from what's expected to be there from an appraised perspective to did you get something? Has it been cannibalized? Has it been, mistreated or just abandoned basically? So, we're seeing again is that there's a lot of different ways that businesses are dealing with all of this, right? They're either avoiding it, they're sticking their head in the sand and doing like an ostrich approach, or they're overcompensating in some ways, that obviously can also cause disruption because I think that, obviously cash is king, but sometimes what ends up happening is that, and this isn't just a tariff related thing. This is with every business is sometimes you do unnatural things to try and generate cash or liquidity. And ultimately in the near term, it results in more cash or your deal, you kind of plug a hole. But in the longer term, from a valuation perspective, when you're getting that new appraisal, it can actually kind of like whipsaw you back and end up in a worse position. And that's what we're seeing sometimes as well with the lenders that we work with. So we try and give them the tools and kind of give them the guidance that I'm walking you through now to kind of give them the arms and legs to be able to maintain their collateral, to be able to be more vigilant around their collateral without, being overbearing to their clients as well, right? So there's like this balance that kind of there's a symbiotic balance that needs to stay in place. But at the end of the day is that, if you're a lender, then you need to protect your investors and make sure that, you understand where you are from a lending perspective. And same thing with if you're a borrower or a business in that instance is, you need to do what's right for your business as well and make sure you're measuring all of the repercussions and have as much information as possible at the time.
Definitely. So, part of that evaluation of the borrower's business, um, most likely is going to include an evaluation of their liquidity. What does a smart and proactive assessment of liquidity look like under today's conditions?
Yeah, I think more frequent touch on your assets and what you're lending on. I think it's also thinking about, how are you partnering with your borrowers and what does that look like and how frequently are you having conversations with them? I think, also we've been helping people with our asset advisory services in terms of not just regular appraisals, but running scenarios that are presuming that certain things happen with the tariffs or certain things happen with the business in underwriting. So as early as, so you get an appraisal, but you also get an analysis and go, here's sort of the business plan that they're laying out for us. Here's how they're dealing with the tariff implications. Now let's also run some other models and we can run 13-week cash flows as well as like, how does that translate into pivots that may be necessary if the tariffs, get increased or if the tariffs don't or if they're moving countries and are there disruption in other underlying costs that maybe they don't see. So all the way through underwriting to when their borrowers in trouble, we're seeing a lot of different ways that our lenders are approaching it. I think the common theme though, Rita, is that I think when we're looking at it is that the earlier intervention. So when you're thinking about calling Gordon Brothers or you're thinking about calling in help, is that it's never too early. I know it can be an uncomfortable conversation, but back to what I said, I think sort of a partnership level is that it allows for more visibility and a lot more, frequent communication and just being open and just saying like, this is, if your borrower really wants to do the right thing, then, usually they're accepting help from outside sources. And I think it's part of like building that partnership is you get the best in the business around the table to be talking about how, their values are going to be affected because at the end of the day, the values are what's going to create their liquidity to run their business. And that's what you want your borrowers doing. You don't want them, you want the CFO dealing with CFO stuff, not over here dealing with obsolete inventory or different things that are distracting from what's already a pretty tall task to be able to run a business through these times.
Definitely. So you've already talked about the impact of tariffs on asset valuation. There's a lot of other economic uncertainty going on right now. How is that impacting valuation and collateral assessment? And what can lenders do to stay ahead of this constantly changing environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think that um, the way that we look at it is that again back to understanding what actually drives your business and what actually drives sort of the main, what the revenue, the higher margin, and how are customers actually doing. So you take your borrower and you sort of expand out their universe, and a lot of times it's just talking to them keeps them up at night, right? Is that again back to what they worried about? Are there ways, and of course they always want more liquidity, and they need more money to be able to effectuate whatever it is the game plan is. And I think that, recognizing that and looking for, resources such as Gordon Brothers, but also, just ways to unlock additional assets on the borrowing base. So we're really good at that, whether it's, is there a way to do some off-balance sheet type activity to be able to generate additional liquidity? Is there a way that you can clean up some of the slower moving inventory, or is there a way that there may be assets that your current lender is either, not lending to the full capacity into or doesn't want to lend to, and maybe they're a little esoteric. So it's really trying to figure out how can we, are there places on their balance sheet that there's value that can get unlocked by a firm like Gordon Brothers or the like. So I think that that's also it is that, what the liquidity, cash is king, we get it, but also like what's realistic, what's right in front of you, because you can't be trying to do 20 things at once. So it's what's most important and what are you actually going to use the additional liquidity for? Because sometimes is that if you take a step back, is that they're using liquid, we generate the liquidity off the balance sheet, and they may be just using it for cash burn rather than actually turning things back around or actually implementing new ways to address their business to kind of work around all of these tariff roadblocks that they're dealing with.
So you talked about a variety of different options there. Can you walk us through just an example of how a company made a strategic decision, or a series of them, based on better asset visibility or liquidity planning?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the big ways is that, looking and renegotiating your supplier contracts. I think again, back to looking at, throughout the entire supply chain is, really putting pressure on the suppliers. They're expecting it to, kind of feel some of the pain with you. And making sure and having an honest conversation with them about, in order to continue that relationship, everybody has to share in it. And short term and long term, a lot of times these are long term partners, and having those conversations earlier on so that it's just not you passing it along to your customer. I think that also that they're going to have to, share in that pain. So we've seen a lot of renegotiations around supplier contracts, and sometimes, just by, the sheer volume of the tariffs, is that sometimes they're just not sustainable. And a lot of people have been proactive about moving where they're actually doing their manufacturing, where they're doing their importing from, and working for exceptions. I think I saw an article about documenting, the metal content rather of, certain things that are getting manufactured to see if there's loopholes in the tariffs that people can work around as well. So we've seen some of that, and obviously could be helpful there. And then, the retailers really built up their inventory ahead of the tariff hikes. Um, Now that there's this, the de minimis exceptions gone away, I think that's going to be another blow to retailers that they're going to have to deal with. That, they've set up, operations in Mexico, for example, to be able to ship things in, and those are all in question now, and that's just going to add, more margin compression that, they need to be dealt with. And again, is that there's a variety of ways to deal with it. It's just each. Honestly, Rita, it's like Al Williams, who runs our real estate division, says like each certain situation is like a snowflake. That's really kind of what this is that, it's like looking and evaluating all of the levers and knobs that you can, push or pull or twist and trying to figure out like what's the best formula. And then back to what do you have liquidity to do? And what is this disruption? What does it mean longer term and short term for the business and your balance sheet and your values? So I think that, it's really, and everything I just said is really a lot for a management team to be able to process on its own. And it's really making sure, again, is early intervention, it's better credit. That's how you maintain your credit quality, and you look for credit enhancements from outside parties, and you try to generate liquidity and do it with it the most you can. So like, and that's going to take a lot of expertise and help.
Sure. It's very complex. So you talked about, negotiating with your suppliers. You talked about, a lot of other things that you could do to save on costs. Are you seeing any other operational pivots or cost strategies that middle market companies are taking?
Yeah,
Or
I mean, I think it's a lot of the things that I said is that looking at non-tariff regions, this was done the last time with tariffs and people moved manufacturing around. I think it's the renegotiations and sometimes there's basically, you can look at like digital tools to try and like figure out ways to work around some of the dependency on more global inputs. But I think that it's really, it's credible if you're able to do it without disrupting your service levels, right? So it's very easy, much more easily said than done to be approaching your suppliers and asking them to take haircuts as well. But at the end of the day is that, sometimes they just can't, right? So we've tried to work with, we have a vendor support program, for example, that we can use our balance sheet to be able to go out and sort of give vendors sort of the comfort that they need to be able to get the inventory in so that you're not getting short shipped, so that you're not getting, COD, which is ultimately hurting the cash flow cycle or the working capital cycle rather of the borrower. So what happens is if you think about it, is you're lending on the inventory that they do have, and then you're helping use the balance sheet to be able to make sure we're getting all of the inventory that they need. So it's like a two-prong approach that some of it's on balance sheet, some of it's off balance sheet, the way we do it. But at the end of the day is that it ultimately, you maintain that vendor relationship through the tough times, and you're kind of like using all the tools in the Gordon Brothers toolbox to help out and do it. I think that's really the way is there's a lot of creativity around it. As long as the asset value is there, then we can, sort of build mouse traps around whatever that situation is. Whether it's, sometimes it's taking your machine or equipment off balance sheet and doing a sale leaseback, and that's an injection of cash as well into the business. So it's really, like I said, is getting the nooks and crannies of the balance sheet and the asset value and leveraging that as much as you can to kind of weather the storm as you transition your business to deal with what could be a long-term, tariff or economic impact to the business, and a consumer that's beginning to get worried.
So I want to circle back to what you said about becoming more of a partner to your borrowers instead of having it be all about the capital. What advice would you give to finance professionals who are trying to guide their clients into like through these pressures without pushing them toward making overly defensive decisions and creating more of that partnership between the parties?
Yeah, I think first and foremost is you got to try to avoid knee-jerk reactions, like overreactions. I think going into the situation is acknowledging that like your borrower is dealing with a lot of volatility. There's a lot of volatility out in the marketplace. And then I think also, whether it's you have within your own portfolio, for me is I have the benefit again of thousands of appraisals that are going on and understanding what's going on in different industries and marketplaces, and seeing like long term and short term how that's affecting values and what some companies are doing to fix it or not. And I would say same thing internally is, be smart about the business, be smart about the industry and understand the challenges. Um, but also you find ways to lean in and provide liquidity, hopefully, to be able to see them weather the storm throughout it. Because I think that, usually the answer of choking off the liquidity from the borrower, that is not the right answer, right? Is like that just exacerbates it and makes it come to a head much more quickly and can actually be value damaging if it's not done in the proper way. So I think it's really getting smart on the assets and how the asset value is affected by whatever measures you need to take. It's like sometimes you do have to move quickly. Sometimes things do, like the bottom drops out on things. But I think it's getting the right people. And again, like can't stress it enough is that if you're getting somebody like Gordon Brothers involved earlier, somebody who has asset expertise, then there's a lot more. It's like anything else, right? Is that if you think about when you go to see your doctor, right? Is that if you get the sniffles and you go and see your doctor, usually it's easier to deal with that than you wait and it turns into a full-blown, flu or something even worse and you've ignored it for a period of time. So it's kind of the same thing with your assets is that the earlier on in the life cycle, if there's like smaller signs, is it doesn't need to be confrontational. It's actually in partnership, like I said, and being able to not come across as defensive, but be forthcoming and helpful. But with helpfulness is that it comes with everybody accepting that there's something that needs to be addressed, and you're trying to do it earlier. So I think that's the way you probably want to be approaching these types of situations.
That's good advice. So do you see all of the volatility that's happening with tariffs as a long-term thing that lenders need to start building into their underwriting, or do you think it is more of a short-term cycle?
I mean, look at it. I think you have to prepare for it to be the long-term cycle, right? If you're just preparing it for it to be short term and it doesn't work out that way, obviously there's a lot more repercussions that can come with that. But we are seeing it. The good news is we are seeing lenders, like I said, is that there's a few banks that we work with on our asset advisory side here that are embedding the tariff sensitivity into underwriting models but they're also looking at portfolios and portfolio stress tests of, short-term and long-term effects on the tariffs. So it's a lot of it like known and unknown. But you sort of you don't know exactly, what the next wave of tariffs or the next, geopolitical kind of environment is going to bring. But at the same time, if you're making the assumption it's longer term, and your underwriting reflects that, then you're kind of that way you're dealing in the reality, both short term and long term.
So what is one tactical move that specialty finance firms can make this quarter to better protect their portfolios and help their clients do the same?
I think look at we're talking about asset-based lending, right? Like you keep saying it and knowing the assets and understanding the assets and having checks along the way on the assets is the best way to do it. I think that, doing it all in-house is a tall task but, understanding, if you're looking at your appraisals, you understand what affects those. I think that's a place to start. I think it's also reaching out and we've structured a lot of different products here at Gordon Brothers to be able to be that sanity check, right? So it doesn't need to be something that's as in depth as an appraisal. It can be, like sort of like a heat map of like what are we seeing? Like give us some key metrics. What are we seeing on trends? And what do we think that are the major things that you need to look at with a specific borrower? And then you need to look at with a specific industry. And then in the event that, that there's liquidity challenges, is that we also bring the balance sheet behind that, the Gordon Brothers balance sheet, to be able to put capital to work behind that expertise to try and give liquidity so long as there's a real game plan in place. So it's sort of like multi-pronged approach, figure out like where where your values are headed, and if there's a way to sort of turn those or deal with challenges versus just ignoring it or holding your breath to get to the other side of it. Maybe there's a way that that we are seeing in the industry or that we see that is apparent to us that maybe it's not, that we can be helpful. But again, touch base with the clients, have those conversations. There's a lot that can be said, not via email, like face-to-face conversation, and they'll tell you what they think they're worried about in their business and what keeps them up at night. And I think you take that and then you leverage the expertise that we can bring or you have around you inside your firm and come up with the best game plan. Again, it's about partnership rather than leaving it to them to figure it out, because I do think that You don't want to overestimate. I think one of the things is that people say a lot of things of how they're dealing with the issues they have with the tariffs and everything, but you don't want to overestimate their ability to execute it, because at the end of the day is that they probably have enough people there to run the business on a regular basis, but when you add in all of these complexities, it can be overwhelming, and you don't want to get it so far down the path. And it's happened too, Rita, a lot of times is, if you're calling us too late, and even if it's an appraisal that was done 6 months ago, there's so much that changes, and it changes so quickly. So it can be a very different company than something that was just appraised a few months ago. If it kind of like snowballs and there's a lot of changes that are made and that they just are just not dealing with appropriately and kind of sweeping under the rug.
So early, deal with it as early as possible is the
Yeah.
message. Yes. Well, that was all the questions I had for you today. Is there anything else that we didn't cover that you think is important about this conversation, or any final thoughts you might have?
No, I think if you take the overall kind of common theme that's throughout it is that whether it's tariff related, real, or it's just dealing with asset values, is that it's really understanding what kind of tools that you can leverage with a firm like Gordon Brothers, that we're an asset advisory firm across the board, and we're much more effective earlier on, right? And we're much more effective. We can be more helpful as you're going through situations in your portfolio and identifying them, or help you identifying them, and then getting solutions. And you're always going to have a happier borrower that you can bring solutions to. And that's what we're here to do, and that's what we're here to help with. And I think that's the key is like don't ignore it. Things don't get better with time, they get worse. And I used to make the joke that, that wine gets better. Wine's the only asset that gets better with time, and even that's a challenge now. So nothing gets better with time. So be proactive, and reach out to your experts at Gordon Brothers or wherever, and be thoughtful about how you do it, and be a partner to your borrowers.
Great advice. Well, thanks so much, Kyle, for being on the podcast today and having this conversation. I appreciate it.
All right, great. Thanks, Rita. Talk to you soon.